Why does it feel like serial killers have vanished? The 1970s and 80s were dominated by killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, the BTK killer, and Ted Bundy, but today those headlines are rare, so what's changed? In this video we're breaking down the rise and fall of serial killers in the US and the UK, why the so-called golden age happened, and whether history might be repeating itself. To understand what happened, we need to start with the timeline. Based on a large database by researchers at Radford University, this is the average number of active serial killers per decade. And one thing immediately stands out: a massive surge in the 1970s and 80s. When people think of serial killers, they almost always picture this era, and for good reason. We had Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ed Kemper, Dennis Rader, Peter Sutcliffe aka the Yorkshire Ripper, the list goes on. At its peak, the number of serial killers was estimated to be as high as 250. So why were the numbers so low earlier on, and what caused this explosion? Let's go back to around the 1800s and 1900s. According to the data, serial killers did exist at this time. I'm sure everyone's heard of Jack the Ripper, but it was in much smaller numbers. Part of that comes down to population size. There were simply fewer people overall. Most lived in small towns where the first homicide would be immediately noticeable and suspects would be identified quickly. Long distance travel was also difficult, and there were no motorways that allowed offenders to move freely between locations. But on the other hand, it's possible that many more serial killers were around, they just hadn't been identified. Forensics were virtually non-existent, police departments were underfunded and isolated from one another, murders weren't connected across jurisdictions, and due to heavy social bias, missing sex workers, impoverished communities, and transient labourers were often ignored altogether. At this time, police not only struggled to catch killers, but even recognised that a serial killer might be operating. In fact, it was only until the 1970s that the term serial killer was recognised. The 1930s and 40s followed a similar pattern, but with one major difference: the world was in crisis. The Great Depression and World War II consumed society, so resources were focused elsewhere and violence became normalised. And for some individuals with violent impulses, war itself became an outlet. By the 1950s, the numbers began to rise slightly. Motorways were being built, cars were becoming affordable, and cities expanded, creating anonymity that didn't exist in small towns. Killers now had mobility, privacy, and opportunity, but it was still limited at this point. Once the 1960s came around, among the previous developments in the 50s, there was now also an increase in hitchhiking and travelling more freely. Again, opportunity expanded, and so did vulnerability. Then came the explosion, the 1970s and 80s. By now, modern road systems were everywhere, travel was easy, and while policing and forensics had improved, critical tools were still missing. As usual, serial killers were still able to operate for years without being detected. However, you might be wondering, it was way easier to get away with murder before the 70s, so why didn't the surge happen earlier? The answer lies in culture. The 1970s marked a major social shift, a time of freedom, counterculture, drugs, and travel. Hitchhiking was widespread. People left their doors unlocked, which is crazy. Women lived independently and asserted autonomy. Sex work increased, and runaways and solo travelling became more common. The LGBTQ community also began to gain visibility and acceptance, allowing people to live more openly than ever before. These were overwhelmingly positive changes, but they also created new vulnerabilities and even more opportunities for killers. But the most significant factor traces back earlier to World War II. Children growing up in the 30s and 40s were often raised in unstable environments. Many experienced absent fathers in the war, harsh punishment norms, and some were placed in institutional care and possibly abused there. Some children's fathers returned from the war with severe PTSD or alcoholism, and at the time the psychological impact of war trauma was barely acknowledged, let alone treated. So basically, a lot of children in this period were deeply traumatised from the war alone, and that's excluding any added trauma like family abuse or neglect. So when these children reached their 20s and 30s, which is the prime age that serial killers begin offending, It was the 1970s, which is right at the peak of the surge. It's also worth noting that pop culture changed around this time too. True crime magazines, pulp fiction, graphic horror films, and the pornographic industry surged in popularity. Violence and sexual imagery became increasingly normalised, both of which are known contributors to violent behaviour in vulnerable individuals. In fact, around this time, shopkeepers were allowing teenage boys and children to buy indecent magazines under the radar, which is crazy. By the 1990s though, the numbers were finally beginning to decline. There were still many active serial killers, but they'd started decades earlier and just hadn't been caught yet. For example, the BTK killer began in 1974 and stopped in 1991. Gary Ridgway began in 1982 and stopped in 1998. And Fred and Rosemary West began in the early 70s and were caught in 1994. But why did they all stop around this time or get caught after so many decades of killing? Well, the internet, CCTV, GPS, shared police databases, and most importantly, DNA profiling. A single strand of hair or a drop of blood could now solve cases that had gone cold for decades. Killers who once operated undetected began getting caught or stopped altogether and then eventually were caught much later on. By 2010, serial killer numbers had collapsed. Today they are at their lowest level since the 1950s. In fact, in the UK there's only been one documented case in recent years, Lucy Letby. And even then her conviction is under scrutiny of whether she did anything at all. And I cover this in another video if you want to watch, I have linked it above. Anyway, society is far more cautious today. People lock their doors for starters, homes have cameras, sex work has largely moved online, and hitchhiking is rare. Women in particular are also more aware of danger today. Unfortunately, we have to carry our keys between our knuckles, share our location with friends, or take pictures of the taxis that we get into so, if we go missing, people know where we were. And with the advancements in forensic technology, potential serial killers are caught after their first murder. For example, Brian Kohberger, he was caught after the first homicide that he committed. He is termed a serial killer because there were 4 individuals killed by him. But he did fit the profile of a serial killer, and if he wasn't caught, he probably would have gone on to commit more murders. But with all of the forensic technology that we have today and social media, he was able to be caught straight away. In fact, what really blew my mind in that particular case was the way that they managed to find his car based on one specific video. Yeah, that's how crazy that technology has advanced. So all in all, it's not that they don't exist today, it's just that they don't get the chance to become a serial killer. But that doesn't mean that the world is safer today. If past surges were shaped by trauma and instability, what about today? We've had a global pandemic, new wars, mass migration causing racial conflicts. So rather than disappearing, predators seem to have adapted. Mass shooters, online violence or radicalisation, and increased sexual violence. These are the modern day equivalents. But there is still a reason for optimism. I know that all of that is quite depressing. We understand trauma better than ever now. Therapy is accessible, child safeguarding has improved, and technology continues to evolve. These factors don't eliminate violence, as we are all very much aware, but they do limit its reach. So serial killers didn't vanish. Society simply closed the doors that once allowed them to thrive. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed, please make sure to subscribe so you can see more content like this.